Hello and welcome to this recorded webinar on equity planning to advance success for men of color in the community colleges. I'm Frank Harris III, and I'm one of the co-directors of the Minority Male Community College Collaborative at San Diego State University with my colleague, J. Luke Wood. And before getting into the webinar, we'd like to acknowledge our affiliate partners, the AMEND organization, the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education, and the Community College League of California. The purpose of this webinar is twofold. First, we'd like to propose an equity planning process to advance success for men of color in community colleges, and also present some evidence-based tools to facilitate this process. We're very active on Twitter, so we encourage you to tweet any thoughts or reflections that come to mind while viewing the webinar. Please use the hashtag M2C3 as well as our respective Twitter handles that are presented here on the screen. For those of you who may be new to the work of M2C3, we'd like to share that we partner with community colleges to build the capacity that's necessary to facilitate student success for men who've been historically underrepresented and underserved in post-secondary education, and rely upon a range of strategies in doing so. First is our National Consortium on College Men of Color, which brings together educators from across the country who engage in information sharing, who discuss best practices to serve men of color in community colleges. Many of them participate in our webinars, such as this one, and also participate in an annual working group meeting that we host here in San Diego each summer. And then we also use the insights that are derived from our research to develop practical tools, such as the Teaching Men of Color in Community College guidebook that you see here presented on the screen. And then we have a number of inquiry tools, such as our Community College Survey of Men, which is our flagship tool. It's an institutional level needs assessment that's used to identify factors that influence student success and patterns that might help to explain outcome disparities that impact men of color in community colleges. Our Community College Student Success Inventory is another tool that's used to inform some of the earlier discussions and planning for success for men of color in community colleges. Our Community College Insights Protocol is a focus group strategy that we use to collect qualitative insights from men of color. And then our Male Program Assessment for College Excellence tool is a tool that we developed for program assessment, particularly programs that target men of color that have a focus on facilitating student success for these students. The question, do you have a plan, really underscores the purpose of this webinar, as well as this quote from Benjamin Franklin: if you fail to plan, you are planning to fail. So we really see this opportunity as a way to help raise some critical questions, as well as talk about strategies and steps that must be undertaken to plan in a way that does not result in the persistent failure of our men of color who are enrolled in community colleges. Before proceeding, we think it's important to define some key terms that we'll be using throughout this webinar. First, men of color refers to men who've been historically underrepresented and underserved in post-secondary education, and tends to focus on Black, Latino, Native American, Southeast Asian, and Pacific Islander students. When we talk about equity inquiry, equity planning, and equity efforts, we really see this as a three-step process in which you conduct the inquiry that's necessary to inform planning and use that planning to inform the efforts that will be undertaken to support men of color in their success. And outcome inequities refer to gaps in achievement between men of color and other student groups. To further explore the linkages between equity inquiry, equity planning, and equity efforts, we thought it would be important to provide a little bit more detail about each of these concepts. First, equity inquiry really is about prioritizing the voices and lived experiences of participants who are the focus of the inquiry. It also examines phenomenon in context and seeks to reveal culturally embedded patterns that shape phenomenon. Equity planning is actually a subset of strategic planning and focuses on establishing directions for enhancing student success, outcomes for underserved students, and also really helps to focus and engage in establishing measurable benchmarks and outcomes. And finally, equity efforts is about enacting institutional effort to close the achievement gap. It focuses on identifying outcome disparities and viewing disparities from what Estella Ben-Simon refers to as an equity-minded perspective, and changing institutional practices to improve student success. Depicted here is the socio-ecological outcomes model, which provides a conceptual framework for all of the work that we do here at M2C3. At the very left of the model are background defining factors and societal factors. We see these as factors that shape men of color's disposition towards education and in many ways shape the ways in which they approach their learning when they enter the community college. Depicted at the center of the model are four socio-ecological domains. The non-cognitive domain, which captures factors related to men of color's identity, as well as interpersonal factors such as their self-efficacy, their locus of control, intrinsic interests, and other related factors. The academic domain, which captures factors that are directly related to the academic experience. The environmental domain, which captures factors that rest outside of the community college context but has some real influence on how men of color experience community college and the success that they have the opportunity to experience. And finally, the campus ethos domain, which captures factors related to sense of belonging, the campus racial, gender, climate, the extent to which men of color perceive that they are welcome to engage, campus resources, and internal validating agents that have an influence on men of color's experiences and success in community colleges. And we say that it's the dynamic interactions between all of these factors that ultimately shape student success, as presented at the far right of the model. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Luke, who's going to provide further context and details on the equity planning process.
The equity inquiry, planning, and effort cycle can be broken down into 8 primary stages. These stages include 1. Set the stage, 2. Form an equity planning group, 3. Clarify the purpose and goals of the equity inquiry, 4. Review existing data, 5. Engage in equity inquiry, 6. Interpret the findings, 7. Disseminate a plan for action, and 8. Implement that action and assess the equity efforts. In prior videos, you have heard us talk about the inquiry component of this cycle. To learn more on this, you can see our videos on the Community College Student Success Inventory and Assessing Initiatives Serving Men of Color. However, while this video touches upon the inquiry process, the primary focus is on the planning component, depicted here by the stages of interpret the findings and disseminate and plan for action. The planning and efforts component of the cycle, though depicted on the prior slide as encompassing 3 primary stages, can also be conceptualized in more detail as including 5 primary stages. The first 3 stages, marked in dark blue, focus on the actual planning process. They include steps for inquiry interpretation, planning of efforts, and gaining feedback. This is where we will focus our time today. The latter 2 components not covered in this webinar video include implementation and assessment, and they are part of the efforts component of the cycle. Let's begin with a focus on the inquiry interpretation aspect of this cycle. It is important that the inquiry component of the cycle be as comprehensive as possible. Using data from multiple sources such as focus groups, surveys, observations, interviews, allows the equity planning team to have a greater understanding of the multitude of factors influencing student success outcomes. The quality of the information provides necessary insight to ensure that the range of interventions employed address factors relevant to students, faculty, staff, and the institution as a whole. M2C3 supports the inquiry process through several tools, including the Community College Survey of Men, the Community College Student Success Inventory, Community College Insights Protocol, and Community College Instructional Development Inventory. We also believe that it is critical that leaders engage in root cause analysis, or RCA, in order to ensure that the interventions employed focus on the root of equity challenges, not the symptoms associated with them. Of course, colleges can also engage in other processes to gain information that may be useful for decision making, including environmental scans that allow you to understand the environment and changing conditions, gap analysis that enables you to understand the current circumstance, the desired goal, and the gap between these, and SWOT analysis.
The Community College Survey of Men is an institutional level needs assessment tool for identifying factors that influence success for men of color in community colleges. It's based upon an extensive review of literature, primarily focusing on student success in community college, men of color in higher education, and college men and masculinities. And it's designed to inform strategic planning and equity-based initiatives. The CCSM has been used by over 50 community colleges in 8 different United States and has had more than 11,000 respondents. Now, colleges who utilize the CCSM receive several reports, including a between-group analysis of items and scales depicting how men of color across racial ethnic groups differ. And it also includes predictive analysis that focuses on identifying factors that are most salient to the experiences of men of color, with targeted reports for faculty, student services staff, and retention program advisors. The Community College Student Success Inventory is an institutional level self-assessment tool for determining an institution's readiness to facilitate successful outcomes for men of color. It is also based on an extensive review of literature and includes key indicators of institutional effectiveness that are organized in 6 different areas, including financial aid, early alert systems, minority male programs and initiatives, institutional research, the context of teaching and learning, and student support services. The Community College Instructional Development Inventory is an institutional level instrument designed to inform professional development programming for instructional faculty who teach historically underrepresented and underserved students. The instrument is currently in the validation stages and should be available for use by mid-fall of 2015. The instrument is designed to assess instructional areas that have been shown to have an intensified benefit for historically underrepresented and underserved men of color. Respondent scores are compared to scores of exemplar faculty members who have a demonstrated track record of success in teaching men of color. The instrument report highlights areas where professional development activities should be concentrated. The CCIDI's items and scales are concentrated in the following areas: teaching strategies, relational dynamics, curricular components, and structural factors. The Community College Insights Protocol is a focus group process that is used to obtain qualitative insights about how men of color experience community colleges. Specifically, the CCIP focuses on salient challenges for men of color, factors that enable men of color to overcome these challenges, institutional practices that facilitate success for men of color, and intentional strategies that should be undertaken by institutions to support these men. CCIP focus groups typically comprise 5 to 7 students and last approximately 90 minutes in duration, and are facilitated by 2 to 3 M2C3 researchers with expertise in qualitative methods. Now, while CCIP focus groups are typically conducted with students, they can also be used as a strategy to collect data from faculty and staff. Participating colleges that utilize the CCIP receive a report that highlights key findings that emerge from the focus groups.
In addition to these tools, we also suggest the use of root cause analysis. Root cause analysis is a process for identifying the causes of the system's success. This analysis has several priorities. The first is distinguishing between root causes, causal factors, and outcomes. Take this slide for example. It portrays our effective response model. Many of you have seen this before. Typically, colleges and universities, when trying to determine what influences long-term outcomes such as completion of a certificate or degree, transferring to a four-year college or university, or even completion of a specific course sequence, focus on the concept of engagement or retention shown on the far right hand of this slide. In other words, the outcomes of completion and transfer often lead to a focus on students' level of engagement and continuation in college. And in some ways, this makes sense. Student engagement is a common concept often used by educators in conversations on student success. Engagement involves the time and effort students invest in their studies and other educationally purposeful activities. Being engaged encompasses a wide array of activities, including the effort students place in the classroom, collaboration with peers, the use of technology, being academically challenged, interactions with faculty and staff, and use of services. And repeated evidence has demonstrated that greater levels of engagement, particularly academic engagement for community college students, leads to enhanced student outcomes such as persistence, achievement, attainment, or transfer. In fact, the concept is so often referenced and traditionally accepted that it has shaped perceptions on student success for generations of scholars and practitioners alike. Informed by this perspective, some educators have supported discussions, engaged institutional assessments, created interventions and programs, and implemented initiatives that focus on mending students. Permeating these efforts are perennial questions on whether students are asking questions in class, responding to questions in class, participating in group discussions, and visiting faculty during office hours. However, rarely is a more fundamental question posed: have we as educators made our students feel welcome to engage? Really, instead of looking at engagement, we could think about: have we made students feel welcome to ask questions in class, respond to questions in class, participate in group discussions, and visit faculty during office hours? Root cause analysis forces us to get at the root of challenges by asking the question, why? If student engagement is a challenge, why is that occurring? If student retention is a concern, why? In the context of this chart here, we see that engagement and retention are not actually root causes, but are ancillary causes, sometimes called causal factors, that influence engagement and retention. Thus, instead of focusing on more intermediate or long-term outcomes, RCA provides us a pathway to get down in the weeds and understand why we see the outcomes that we have. However, in an RCA context, while intermediate outcomes such as engagement and retention are influenced by whether students feel welcome to engage in class, have a sense of belonging in college, and feel like they matter, we must still ask ourselves the question, why? Why is that occurring? Why would a student not feel welcome to engage, or have a perception that they belong, or believe that they matter? When we ask these questions, it uncovers another set of factors, including the prevalence of validating messages, inclusionary environments, critical representation of diverse peoples, culturally relevant teaching and learning practices, multicultural counseling strategies, and others. As a result, in an RCA context, while the intermediate outcomes of engagement and retention and the effective responses of welcomeness to engage, belonging, and mattering are all critical and important, we must delve deeper and focus on our interventions on the reasons that these challenges are taking place, such as those depicted on this slide under positive facilitators. Beyond distinguishing between root causes, causal factors, and outcomes, as well as asking the important question of why, RCA encourages the identification of multiple solutions. Often, the triangulation of multiple solutions can produce more positive outcomes than a myopic approach. Also, too, when you have several solutions, you can then determine among your options which options are most key based on your budget, likelihood for impact, and other selection factors. In addition, RCA analysis practitioners argue that not all causes are equal. Thus, while you may get down to a multitude of root causes, it should be known that not all of these will have the same influence on student outcomes. And often, it is the confluence of multiple root causes that creates conditions that foster outcome inequities. Many RCA users engage in pictorial depictions of root causes, causal factors, and outcomes. This representation, called a thought map, is a very useful exercise for equity planning teams. The root cause analysis process has several steps that should be undertaken. First, you want to examine data to identify areas of disproportionate impact or outcome inequities. Then, to ensure that the conversation is productive and centers on strategies that are within the locus of control of the institution, these challenges should be contextualized around concepts of institutional responsibility. Using data derived from your inquiry processes, you will want to engage in hierarchical nested modeling of causes. We'll show you an example of this on the next slide. As part of that model, you should identify the ancillary factors or causal factors influencing the gaps, as well as the root causes. If you have engaged in a SWOT analysis, you may also want to depict institutional strengths relevant to the identified causes and outcomes. This slide depicts an example root cause analysis. In this example, the primary challenge we are focused on is depicted in blue: transfer gaps between men of color and their majority peers, which demonstrated that there were some inequities taking place. So, based upon the inquiry processes and experiential knowledge, we have determined that there were two primary factors that led to this. First was many students were not taking transfer level courses because they were exiting during basic skills, and there was a lack of access to information. So then, using the focus on why, we would then ask ourselves, well, why is that occurring? So let's take the first example. Students are not taking transfer level courses because they're exiting during basic skills. Well, why did that occur? Well, because some students were attracted to CTE and other non-CTE programs. Then we have to ask the question, well, why did that happen? Well, some staff hold stereotypical assumptions of students' abilities. Another reason is that the students are not making a demonstrated decision to transfer until later on. Well, then we have to ask ourselves, well, why is that occurring? Why are students not making those decisions? Well, because educational planning requirements sometimes force people to make decisions too early on. And of course, we need more staff in order to be better trained to tell students how to properly engage in that process, to use education planning as a guide and not a delimiter of their abilities. Moreover, some students are attracted to CTE and other non-CTE programs because of stereotypical assumptions of their abilities. Staff are also not properly trained when it comes to culturally relevant engagement practices. Looking at the top right-hand side of the slide, we can see that access to information was another concern. So there was two challenges that resulted. First was that there was no access to the transfer center staff, or limited access, and students were not aware of online resources that provided similar information. Well, why would they not be aware of online resources? Well, among some causes are that students didn't feel welcome in the transfer center. And that could be because of a root cause, as that there are rigid rules about who can access the transfer center based upon how many credits they earned, their degree profiles, and other factors. In terms of access to the transfer center staff, maybe some students reported that they felt rushed or that they were not on campus during the transfer center usage times. So why would students feel rushed? Well, possibly there are too few walk-in appointments, or there are no staff with whom they readily identify, or possibly there's too few personnel. Using this approach, we get down at the root causes of the transfer gaps. The root causes identified in this very simplistic analysis is that staff are not adequately trained, there are too few personnel, there are too few walk-in appointments, there are few staff with whom they readily identify, and there are rigid rules around who can access the transfer center. Of course, there are other ancillary factors as depicted by the gray circles or ovals in the middle, such as access to the staff, feeling rushed, being tracked. Those are also concerns that may need to be addressed after we have focused primarily on those root causes. Next, we're going to look at the planning component of the equity planning and efforts cycle. Begin by determining the most salient root causes. You can do this by rank ordering causes based upon a set of criteria, both for the root causes and for the ancillary effects. This may be determined based upon salient factors that are specific to your institutional context. We suggest identifying the top causes and ancillary effects in each area. Now, we're using 5 here as a general rule of thumb, but the number itself is arbitrary. Really, it's getting down to those most salient root causes and ancillary effects that are most effective on the problem. Then what you want to do is engage in completing the planning matrix that's featured on the next slide. The information derived from the equity inquiry and from the root cause analysis will help you in identifying the goals, desired outcomes, resources, and other elements that are necessary for completing the matrix. This slide depicts the M2C3 equity planning map. We suggest this map as a guide for engaging in your planning efforts. First, using the root cause analysis and information from the inquiry, you would identify a primary challenge. Then, you would identify the domain in which that challenge resides, how the interventions that might be employed might align with institutional goals and documents and vision statements and strategic plans, establishing a goal for what you want to see, articulating desired interventions, the resources that would support those interventions, desired outcomes, an assessment strategy, and responsibilities of who is responsible for what. In terms of the first component of domains, we recommend using Wood and Palmer's 8 domains of institutional responsibility. This model follows an Aston's IEO approach, looking at inputs, experiences, and outcomes. However, different from Aston's model, which focuses on what are students' inputs, their background characteristics such as their age, income, high school GPAs, their experiences in college, and then their outcomes. This flips that whole concept and places it with the focus on institutional responsibility, looking at the institutional context as the inputs, the institutional actions as the experiences, and the institutional outcomes indicative of the institution's success. In terms of those primary domains of institutional responsibility, this model has areas called institutional actions, and the areas of responsibility include partnerships, structures, climates, programs, practices, policies, resources, and additional inquiry. Each of these areas represents a domain that the institution is responsible for as it relates to facilitating and fostering student success. After you've identified the challenges from the root cause analysis and placed that into the model, we then recommend identifying which domain the area of responsibility resides within. So for example, if it's a teaching and learning consideration that deals with practices in the classroom, you might want to put under domain practices. If it's a structural concern, then you would put structures. If it deals with partnerships, you would want to put partnerships. The reason to do this is to help to make sure that using this 8 domains framework, that you're identifying interventions, challenges, and outcomes that are focused comprehensively within all of the 8 domains of responsibility. However, the 8 domains should serve as a guide. The primary driver of where the intervention should be and determining of holistic activities should be based upon the findings from the inquiry and RCA process. Next, you want to think about alignment. It is critical that whatever interventions are put into place and whatever challenges that are addressed align with institutional strategic plans, mission statements, and vision statements. These guiding documents make sure that whatever interventions are put into place will have longevity and sustainability, possibly beyond the influx of any equity funding that may be at play. Thus, the institutional strategic plan should serve to guide programmatic and interventions and initiatives influencing the mission, goals, and outcomes of those desired activities. Next, what you want to do is to make sure that whatever challenges and outcomes that you are focused on have direct alignment with the institutional strategic plan and other guiding documents of the institution, such as the mission statement and vision statements. It's important that whatever interventions come out of the equity planning process are directly aligned with the institutional strategic plan. This will help to assure that the longevity of those activities will take place even possibly beyond the influx of any equity monies. In terms of goals, you want to identify the general goal that you want to have in each of the areas. Goals are broad statements that can often be incorporated as part of the strategic plan but are not measurable. When we give you a filled-in example of this matrix, this may make more sense. But in general, the difference between goals and outcomes is that goals are not measurable and are generally broad statements. In terms of interventions, you then want to help to think about what are the interventions that need to be put into place to address the challenges that were identified. Of course, the root cause analysis RCA can help to inform this, as well as information from the equity inquiry process. Common examples of interventions that are employed include professional development for faculty and staff, early alert systems, transportation support such as bus passes, book loan systems, intrusive advising, counseling, and support services such as tutoring, face-to-face mandatory orientation, stackable curricular realignment, paid internships and externship opportunities, college success courses, and the incorporation of cultural competency into hiring and RTP processes. Of all of these, likely the most critical is professional development for faculty and staff. As you delve deeper into inquiry and root causes, one thing that you may learn is that there's a need for more development of faculty and staff in order for them to have the capacity necessary to serve men of color and other historically underrepresented and underserved students. You also need to think about the resources that will support desired interventions. Resources can be multifaceted, including people, time, space allocations, technology infrastructure, and funding. We do recommend that you think about how the resources that are needed align with budget and planning cycles of the institution. Referring back to the original gaps that led to the analysis, gaps in retention, completion, and achievement, you want to think about what are the outcomes that you would like to see in each of those areas. Those outcomes should be aligned with the challenges and interventions that are being focused on. The outcomes that you want guide the interventions and the rest of the chart. Outcomes are very detailed and should examine a particular competency that we hope to accomplish. Again, along with other elements of this chart, outcomes should be in direct alignment with the institutional strategic plan. You then want to set up an assessment structure to make sure that whatever interventions are being employed are being assessed based upon their progress, their process, and the outcomes. You want to think about when will this occur. You want to make sure that the outcomes are guiding the assessment, not the assessment determining the outcomes. You want to look at multiple measures to make sure that you're getting a holistic picture of how you're influencing your desired outcomes. And you want to think about how the data will be reported. Then you want to confer with your team to determine the responsibilities. Who is responsible for each of these areas? Who's responsible for data collection and analysis? Who's responsible for programmatic interventions? We also need to think about how these responsibilities are formalized and the systems that will be put into place to make sure that they are carried out. Here is one brief sketch of what you might see in each of these different areas for an equity planning map. In this case, the challenge was that students were feeling unwelcomed in class. This resided within the practices domain. This area of concern had direct alignment with the institutional mission and strategic plan. In terms of the institutional mission, the focus was on fostering a climate of belonging and affirmation. So obviously this would be a relevant concern. In terms of the strategic plan, it focused on the second element of that plan, which dealt with building a healthy campus ethos. Our goal here was then to build a culturally engaging classroom. We decided that two primary interventions were needed: professional development for faculty on culturally relevant teaching practices, and coaching on using andragogical techniques in classroom materials that are culturally relevant. The resources for carrying out these activities included instructional materials, funding to hire experts to come in and do professional development, funding to send faculty to professional development conferences such as NISOD, and release time for faculty and coaches to participate in additional training. The primary outcome of focus was to decrease gaps between white men and men of color on perceptions of welcomeness to engage, and we have a specific timeline for when we want to see that occur. The assessment materials are multifaceted to ensure that we're getting a holistic picture of how we're addressing that outcome. This would be used through the Community College Survey of Men, focus group data, classroom observations, and course evaluations, if they were amended to be sensitive enough to address these concerns. And then in terms of responsibilities, faculty identification for participation in the interventions include division deans. They're responsible for that. Faculty training would reside under the professional development coordinator for the campus, and assessment would reside within the realm of the department chairs and the Office of Institutional Research. From here, you want to determine the most appropriate interventions. Obviously, while you would like to address multiple outcomes, multiple challenges, and multiple interventions, funding is likely limited. So what you want to do is establish a predetermined criteria for determining appropriate interventions. Sample criteria may include the potential for impact, the scalability of the intervention, the sustainability of the intervention over time, its cost effectiveness, and its alignment with institutional guiding documents. You also want to think about how you're going to triangulate interventions around target outcomes. You then want to ensure that outcomes encompass a range of outcome types, those that are learning, those that are effective, those that are performance-based, that reside within multiple domains based upon the 8 domains of institutional responsibility, and address multiple areas, including academic affairs and student affairs. If most of the interventions are concentrated in academic affairs, or most of the interventions are concentrated in student affairs, they won't be as effective. It needs to be a partnership between the two entities. Finally, you want to identify interventions that are focused on root causes with some attention to the causal or ancillary factors. Root causes will give you a better long-term effect. Now, it should be noted that causal factors typically have a faster time to see differences. Meaning when you're focused on some of those ancillary causes, you'll likely see differences quicker, but those differences won't be sustained over time because the root causes will emanate in other areas. The final stage of the equity planning and effort cycle focused on the actual planning component is feedback. What you want to do is after you've created the plan, you want to release an executive summary of the plan 2 weeks in advance of releasing the full plan. This will provide for initial insight into how the campus community may react. Of course, it's very important to remain transparent through this entire process. You don't want to have folks in the community blindsided because they may not be as supportive of the plan. The executive summary release allows them to get a glimpse into the plan to prepare them for the fuller details. Then you want to release the full plan to the college community. You want to emphasize that it is preliminary and that you are looking for feedback on it. Again, it's important for folks to have a sense of ownership and buy-in in the process. You then want to hold multiple forums to allow for public feedback. Town halls, colloquia, symposia, faculty senate meetings, staff union meetings, etc. Feedback should also come from students as well. Remember, this plan is designed to support student equity, so students should have a say in some of the equity efforts. You also then want to use the opportunity to gain buy-in. Buy-in is critical in order to ensure that the implementation of the plan is smooth and successful. Taking feedback from the multiple forums, you want to make revisions to the plan and release a final document. One strategy that you may consider in order to gain additional buy-in from the campus community is to consider holding back a small percentage of funds for innovative endeavors. What you would want to do then is establish a criteria based upon the outcomes and challenges that were identified and provide an opportunity for a small percentage of funds, possibly 10 to 15%, to be open for small proposals that can be submitted by faculty members and staff members and administrators for projects that they believe would help to address those equity efforts that may have fallen outside the scope or focus of the analyses of the planning committee. As always, we'd like to thank our advisory board. Their support enables this work that we do. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions. We look forward to connecting with you. Thank you.